"You need not look at me as though I mean to devour you," the Duke of Denmark said quietly, and the low, even sound of his own voice surprised him, for he had not known he would say it until the words were already in the cold morning air between them. "Whatever you have been told of me, Miss Fairley, you may set half of it aside," and the other half was true only of a younger man. He watched the woman before the altar rail. She stood very straight in a gown of pale grey silk that had plainly been made in haste, the hem still bearing the faint marks of a seamstress's chalk, and her hands were folded so tightly at her waist that the knuckles had gone white. She did not answer him. She only lifted her chin a degree, as one braces against a blow one has been promised, and looked past his shoulder at the tall windows of the chapel, where a thin March sun laid long bars of light across the flagstones. Adrian Vane, 9th Duke of Denmark, had married many things in his imagination and none of them in life, and he had not thought until this hour that his wedding would feel so much like a sentence read over two prisoners at once. He did not blame her for her fear. He knew precisely what she had heard, that he had let his first betrothed die of a fever alone, that he had struck a groom lame with a riding crop, that the north wing of Denmark Court was shut because something had happened there that the servants would not name. Half of it was slander, and the other half was so twisted from its true shape that he had long since given up untangling it. A man could not chase every whisper across 3 counties. He had stopped trying at 30, and now, at 38, he had stopped hearing them at all, but she heard them. He could see it in the set her mouth. The chaplain, a nervous elderly man with ink still on his fingers, cleared his throat and began. Adrian answered where he was meant to answer, in a voice that carried without effort, and when the moment came he took her cold hand in his and slid the plain gold band over her finger with a care that he hoped she felt and suspected she did not. Her hand trembled once, like a bird held too long, and then went still by an act of visible will. He admired that. He had not expected to admire anything about the morning. "You may kiss the bride," the chaplain murmured, and there was in his voice the anxious hope of a man who wanted only to be gone. Adrian looked down at Rowena Fairley, at the fair, tired face and the grey eyes that met his at last, wide and steady and full of a dread she was too proud to show. He did not stoop to her. Instead he raised her hand, the one that now wore his ring, and pressed his lips lightly to the backs of her fingers, the smallest and most formal of courtesies, and released her. "I will not take what has not been offered," he said, low enough that only she could hear. "Not this. Not anything. You have my word, Duchess, and my word is the one thing about me that no one has ever called false." Something moved across her face then. Not gratitude. He thought, for gratitude was a luxury the frightened could not afford, but a flicker of confusion, the first crack in the wall she had built against him. It was enough. He turned and offered her his arm, and after a breath she laid her fingertips upon it, and they walked back down the short aisle together as man and wife. It had been arranged in a fortnight. That was the shame of it, though the shame was not hers and not, he told himself, entirely his. Sir Harold Fairley had been a gentleman of good blood and ruinous judgment, and when the man dropped dead over his accounts one raw January night, he left behind a mortgaged house, a mountain of debt, and a daughter of 25 with no fortune, no near kin, and no prospect but the workhouse or a governess's post in some cold northern family. The debts, as it fell out, were held largely by Denmark. Adrian had bought them up years ago, half of them, without ever meeting the man, simply because his steward advised it and the notes had come cheap. He had not known until Fairley died that the whole tangle led back to a single unprotected woman. He might have foreclosed. That was what men did. He might have taken the house, a modest manor called Renfield, some 12 miles off, and turned her out, and no court in England would have blinked. His own solicitor had recommended exactly that, in a dry letter that used the word regrettable 4 times and meant it not at all. Instead, Adrian had ridden to Renfield himself in the sleet, and found her in the library, trying to sell her dead father's books to a dealer who was cheating her, and he had stood in the doorway a long moment watching her argue with quiet, hopeless courage over the price of a Virgil. And something in him that he had believed long dead had turned over in its sleep. He had offered marriage. Not out of desire, he barely knew her, but out of a colder, stranger impulse, that here was a wrong he could set right, a debt he could cancel not with money but with his name, and that a woman with such a straight back deserved better than to be sold cheap to strangers. He had told himself it was practical. He needed a wife, the succession wanted, and here, his aunts had nagged him for a decade. He had told himself all of it, and none of it was the true reason, and he had known even then that it was not. She had accepted because she had nothing else. He was not fool enough to pretend otherwise. When he named the terms, that Renfield would be settled on her outright, free of debt, hers to keep whatever came, that she would want for nothing, that she need only take his name, she had looked at him across the ruined library with those steady grey eyes and asked one question, and one only. "And what will you require of me, your grace, in return for so much?" He had understood the question beneath the question. He had answered it plainly. "Your presence at my table when it suits you, your name beside mine in the parish register. Nothing more that you do not freely give." "I am not buying a wife, Miss Fairley. I am cancelling a debt in the only coin that leaves you standing." She had not believed him. He had seen that too. But she had had no choice, and so here they were, wed in the chapel at Denmore before a handful of servants and 2 of his aunts, and now walking out into the pale spring light as strangers bound for life. The wedding breakfast was a subdued affair. His aunt Lady Bramwell, a stout and formidable woman who missed nothing, watched the new Duchess across the table with a shrewdness that Adrian did not like, and his younger Aunt Georgiana, softer and sillier, made bright empty conversation into the silence. Rowena ate almost nothing. She answered when spoken to gracefully in a low, clear voice, and the moment the meal allowed it she asked leave to withdraw and rest, for the journey had been long and the day longer. "Of course," Adrian said, rising as she rose. "Mrs. Poole will show you your rooms. They are in the east wing, where the morning comes first. I hope you will find them warm." She paused at that, one hand on the back of her chair. "My rooms," she repeated very quietly. "Your rooms," he said. "You will find a lock upon the door and the key upon the inside of it. I trust you will use it however you see fit." For a moment she simply looked at him, and he could not read what was in her face. Surprise, perhaps, or the weariness of one who has been offered kindness before and found a hook in it. Then she inclined her head. "Thank you, your grace," she said, and followed the housekeeper from the room, and Adrian sat down again to the cooling remains of his own wedding breakfast and the sharp, curious eyes of his Aunt Bramwell. "Well," Lady Bramwell said, when the door had closed, "that is not the marriage I expected of you, Adrian." "No," he agreed. "I don't imagine it is. She is afraid of you. She has been given every reason to be." He turned his glass slowly on the cloth without drinking. "Half the county has spent 7 years teaching her to be. I can hardly undo it in a fortnight. Then why marry the girl at all? You could have set her up in a cottage and solved your conscience for 1/10 of the trouble." He was quiet a moment. Outside the tall windows the March wind pushed the bare elms about, and far off a dog barked and was silent. "Because a cottage would have made her my dependent," he said at last, "and a wife she is my equal mistress of this house, with a claim on it that no one can revoke, not even I. There is a difference, Aunt, between rescuing a woman and freeing her. I have had enough of being the sort of man who does the first and calls it the second." Lady Bramwell studied him for a long moment with her sharp dark eyes, so like his own. "You have grown strange in your solitude, nephew," she said. But she said it gently, and there was something in her expression that might, in a warmer woman, have been approval. Adrian did not answer. He was thinking of the way the new Duchess had straightened her back at the altar, bracing for a blow that had not come, and of how many blows must have fallen upon her before, to teach her that bracing so well. That night he did not go near the east wing. He heard faintly, through the long quiet of the house, the small sounds of her settling a door, a step, the low murmur of the maid he had assigned her, and then silence, and he imagined her turning the key in the lock and lying awake in the dark of a strange house, waiting for a footstep at the door that would not come. He hoped she slept. He doubted she did. He himself did not sleep. He sat late in his study with a single candle and the estate ledgers open before him, not reading them, and thought about the long empty years behind him and the strange new fact of a wife under his roof who feared him, and he wondered, as he had not let himself wonder in a very long time, whether a man could be forgiven for the reputation others had built for him. If only he lived long enough and patiently enough to prove it false. The candle guttered near dawn. He rose, stiff and cold, and went to the window and looked out across the dark park toward the east wing, where a single light still burned behind a curtained pane. So she was awake too. Two strangers, wed against the grain, each keeping vigil in a house too large for either. He let the curtain fall. "Give her time," he said aloud to the empty room, though he was not sure whom he was instructing, the house himself, or the God who had let so much go wrong in Adrian Vane's life. "Give her only time, and ask her nothing she is not ready to give." It would prove in the months to come the hardest promise he had ever kept, and the truest. The first mornings of their marriage settled into a strange, careful rhythm, like two dancers who did not know the steps and were determined not to tread on one another. Adrian rose early, as he always had, and rode the boundaries of the home farm in the grey before breakfast. When he returned, he found the Duchess already at the small table in the morning room, dressed and composed, a book beside her plate. She always rose when he entered. He always bade her keep her seat, and she never quite did. They spoke of small things, the weather, the state of the roads, whether the woodsman had cut enough for the fires, and the moment the meal was done she withdrew to whatever occupied her, and he to whatever occupied him, and the great house swallowed them up in its separate wings. He gave her the run of it. He was careful to make that plain. On the third day he had walked her through the principal rooms himself, a formal tour, his hands clasped behind his back so that she should never mistake his nearness for a demand. "The library is yours to use as freely as your own," he told her, pausing in the doorway of the long room where the tall windows faced south and 10,000 books stood in their dark ranks. "My grandfather collected the poets, my father the naturalists. I have added little, but I have read most. You need never ask my leave to come here, or to take a book to your rooms, or to sit the whole day if you wish. It is a house, Duchess, not a gale, whatever you may have been told." She stepped into the library and stood a moment among the books, and he saw her shoulders ease, the smallest fraction, as though something in the smell of old paper and leather had reached a part of her that his words could not. She trailed a fingertip along a shelf. "My father had a library," she said, not looking at him. "It was the last thing to go. I sold it in January to a man who cheated me, because I could not tell one edition from another, and he could." A pause. "You saw that. You were in the doorway." "I was," he admitted. "I confess I let him make his offer before I threw him out, because I wished to know your temper before I made mine known. You argued very well over that, Virgil. I lost the argument." "You lost it because he held the money and you held the need," Adrian said. "That is not the same as being wrong." He hesitated, then went on, "because it seemed important that she understand it. I bought them back, your father's books. All of them, from the dealer, the following week, before you had left Renfield. They are boxed in the North Store. When you wish to have them, you have only to ask, and they will be brought to whatever room you name here, or Renfield, or wherever you should ever choose to live." She turned then and looked at him fully, and for a long moment she said nothing at all. Her grey eyes searched his face with a directness that he found he could not look away from, as though she were trying to find the trick in him, the hidden cost, the hook beneath the bait. "Why?" she said at last. It was the same question she had asked in the ruined library, and he understood that until she had a true answer to it she would never be able to rest. "Because they were yours," he said simply, "and because a man who takes everything from a woman and leaves her only her name has not been generous. He has merely been thorough. I did not wish to be thorough with you, Rowena." It was the first time he had used a Christian name. He saw her mark it. She did not tell him he might not. "You are not," she said slowly, "at all what I was told you would be." "No." He looked away out the tall window to where the park ran down to a silver line of river. "But you should not trust that yet. Kindness in a first week costs nothing. Wait and see whether it holds when I'm tired or crossed, or in the black moods that come on me sometimes. Then decide what I am. I would rather you knew the whole of me and stayed than believed a pretty half and were disappointed." He had not meant to say so much. He was not a man who spoke of himself. But there was something in her steadiness that drew honesty out of him the way a lodestone draws iron, and he found, to his own surprise, that he did not regret it. Rowena Fairley, Rowena Vane, now, though the name sat strangely on both of them, inclined her head. "Then I will wait and see," she said. "It seems only fair. That night she did not lock her door. He knew because he passed the east corridor on his way to his own rooms, later than usual, and the maid Sarah was just leaving the Duchess' chamber, and the door stood ajar a hand's breadth with the warm light of a fire behind it, and no key turned as he passed. He did not slow his step. He did not so much as glance in, but something in his chest that had been clenched since the wedding loosened by a degree, and he slept that night for the first time in a week. The black moods he had warned her of were no invention. They came on him the way weather came on the moor, without warning, out of a clear sky, and stayed until they chose to lift. They had their root in things he did not speak of, and for 8 years he had ridden them out alone in the north wing, the shut-up wing, where no servant went and no guest was ever taken, and where the truth of Adrian Vane lay behind a locked door that the whole county had invented 100 lies to explain. The truth was this. When he was 30, Adrian had been betrothed to a girl named Cecily Marchmont, bright, laughing, beloved of everyone, and least of all suited to him, though he had not known it then. He had loved her the way a solemn man loves sunlight, grown wisely, believing it would warm him forever. And Cecily, it emerged too late, had not loved him at all. She had loved another man, a penniless officer, and had accepted Adrian only to please her ambitious father, and on the very eve of the wedding she had fled, not with the officer in the end, for the officer had proved false too, but simply away, into a wild autumn night and a river swollen with rain, and she had gone off the ford at Denmore Bridge in the dark, and they had found her 2 days later, 3 miles down the water. The county said the Duke had driven her to it. The county said he had a cruel hand and a colder heart, and that no woman could bear to be his. The truth, that she had never meant to marry him, that he had loved her and been betrayed, that he had ridden through the whole of that terrible night searching the black river with a lantern, and had pulled her small drowned body from the reeds himself, with his own hands, and had never in 8 years spoken of it to a living soul. The truth was not a story anyone wished to tell. The lie was better. The lie made him a monster, and monsters were simpler than grieving men. He had shut the north wing because it held her rooms, the rooms prepared for a bride who never came to them, still hung with the pale blue silks she had chosen. And he could not bear to see them and could not bear to change them, and so he had turned the key and let the county build its legend on the silence. The mad Duke, the murderer of Denmore, the man whose bride had drowned and then wed him. He had let it stand for 8 years because it was easier than the truth, and because the truth belonged to no one but himself, and because a man so armored in dark rumor was, he had found, wonderfully undisturbed. No mothers threw their daughters at him. No fortune hunters courted his sisters, for he had none. He had lived alone with his ghosts and his ledgers and his moor, and he had told himself it was enough, and it had very nearly been. And then he had bought a dead man's debts and ridden through the sleet to a ruined library, and found a woman with a straight back arguing over a Virgil, and everything he had settled so carefully into place had begun, quietly, to come unsettled. He did not tell Rowena any of this. It was far too soon. She feared him still, and grief was a thing one did not offer a frightened woman as one might offer a chair. But he found himself in the weeks that followed, less inclined to shut himself in the north wing when the black moods came. Instead he rode, he worked. He took his solitary meals across the wide table from the composed, watchful woman who was his wife, and slowly, so slowly he scarcely marked it happening, the meals grew less silent. It began with the books. She read voraciously. And one evening at dinner she made an observation about a passage in Cowper so exactly right, so quietly incisive, that he set down his fork and looked at her, and they fell into an argument about the poet that lasted through 3 removes and ended with both of them laughing, she first. A startled sound as though she had forgotten she could, and then he low and rusty at himself for having risen so hotly to defend a dead man's verse. The laughter frightened her. He saw it. She caught herself in it and went still and wary, as though she had let slip something she meant to guard. He did not press her. He only said gently, "You have a good ear for it. Better than mine, I think. My grandfather would have liked you very much." "Would your father?" she asked. It was, he understood, a real question and a careful one. "No," Adrian said honestly. "My father liked no one who was cleverer than himself, and he could not abide being contradicted, least of all by a woman. He would have found you insufferable." He paused. "I find you the opposite." Make of that what you will. She made, for the moment, nothing of it. But the next evening she came down to dinner with a book of Cowper under her arm, and set it beside her plate and said, before he had even sat, "I have found the passage you were wrong about," and there was the faintest ghost of challenge in her voice, and Adrian Vane, 9th Duke of Denmark, feared through 3 counties, felt something in his chest turn over again in the dark and begin, very cautiously, to wake. Spring came slowly to Denmark, as it always did in the high country, but it came, and with it a thaw that Adrian felt as much in his own house as in the melting snows of the moor. The Duchess took up the reins of the household with a quiet competence that surprised even Mrs. Poole, who had run it unchallenged for 20 years and had braced, like everyone, for a difficult mistress. Instead, Rowena went about the house learning it, the linen presses, the still room, the accounts of the kitchen and dairy, and where she found a thing done well she praised it, and where she found it done ill she mended it so gently that no one took offence. The servants who had feared her coming came within a month to watch for her with a shy pleasure, and Adrian, who noticed such things because a solitary man notices everything, marked the change with a satisfaction he could not have explained. She began to garden. There was a walled plot behind the east wing, gone to seed and bramble in the long years of his neglect, and one bright morning he found her there in an old apron with her sleeves turned back, on her knees in the black earth, hauling up bindweed with a fierce and joyful concentration. And he stood at the gate and watched her a while before she knew he was there, and thought that he had not seen anything so alive in that garden, or in himself, in a very long time. "I hope you will forgive the liberty," she said when she saw him sitting back on her heels and pushing a strand of hair from her face with the back of a muddy wrist. Mrs. Poole said the plot had not been touched in years, and no one would miss it. "I did not think to ask your leave before I dug." "You need never ask my leave to bring a dead thing back to life," Adrian said. "God knows the place has enough of the other." He came in through the gate and looked at the beds she had cleared, the dark-turned earth, the seedlings she had already begun in a cold frame she had somehow found and mended. "What will you grow?" "Herbs first, then whatever pleases me. Roses, I think, along the south wall, where they will have the sun." She looked up at him, shading her eyes, and there was in her face a directness that had not been there in March, a growing ease that he prized above almost anything. "I have never had a garden of my own. My father's was my mother's, and after she died he let it go, and I was too small to save it. I have wanted one all my life." "Then it is yours," he said. "All of it. Do with it what you will. I will send Coombs to spade the harder ground for you, if you will let him, and you shall have whatever seed and root you write for from the nurseries at York. Consider it wholly your own kingdom, Duchess, and me your grateful subject when the roses come." She laughed at that, the easy laugh now, no longer startled out of her, and it was such a good sound in that ruined garden, under the pale spring sky, that Adrian carried it about with him the whole of that day like a coin in a pocket, turning it over. He began, without quite deciding to shape his days around the small chance of her company. He rode in the mornings still, but he came back sooner. He found reasons to be in the library when she was there, a ledger to consult, a letter to write at the great desk. And they would sit for an hour in a silence grown companionable, each with a book, the fire ticking, and now and then she would read him a line she liked, or he her, and the sharing of it had become the best hour of his day. He told himself it was nothing. He told himself he asked nothing of her, and would ask nothing, and that was true. But a man may keep every promise he has made and still find his heart moving somewhere he had not given it leave to go. It was Lady Bramwell, come again to Denmark in April on one of her descents, who named the thing aloud that Adrian had not yet named to himself. "You are in love with your wife," she said over the chessboard, not looking up from her rook. Adrian's hand paused above the pieces. "I am fond of her," he said. "She is easy to be fond of. That is not the same thing." "It is precisely the same thing in your case, because you are a man who has spent 8 years being fond of nothing at all." His aunt moved her rook and took his bishop with a small satisfied click. "I have watched you at dinner. You listened to her the way a starving man watches bread. You have not looked at anyone that way since." She stopped with a rare tact. "Since a very long time. It becomes you. I only hope she comes to feel the same for both your sakes." and I am not at all sure she does. She is grateful to you. Gratitude is a chilly bedfellow, Adrian. It is not love, and a woman who marries for rescue may spend her whole life confusing the two and be miserable and never know why. He said nothing for a while. He studied the board and did not see it. She married me because she had no other choice, he said at last low. I have never let myself forget that. Whatever she comes to feel or does not feel, I will not press her toward me. If she is fond of me, that is more than the bargain promised, and more than I deserve. If she wishes one day to live apart at Renfield, as her own woman, the door is open and always will be. I made her a wife so that she should be free, aunt. I will not now cage her with my own wanting. Lady Bramwell looked at him a long time, and the sharpness went out of her face, and something older and sadder came into it. You are a better man than the county deserves to have slandered, she said quietly, and a great deal more of a fool than I gave you credit for. Because I will tell you what I have seen, Adrian, that you have not. That girl watches you when you are not looking exactly as you watch her. She is halfway to loving you already, and terrified of it, because the last man she trusted with anything took everything and gave her sorrow, and she does not yet believe you will not do the same. You need not press her, no. But do not stand so far off in your nobility that she reads it as coldness and turns back into her fear. Kindness that never comes closer is only another kind of locked door. The words stayed with him. He turned them over that night, and many nights after, and he came slowly to think there was truth in them. He had built his gentleness partly out of honor and partly, he began to suspect, out of fear, the fear of a man who had loved once and lost, and who found it easier to give everything and ask nothing than to risk the terrible vulnerability of reaching out a hand that might not be taken. It was safer to be the grave, generous stranger than the hoping lover. Cicely had taught him that lesson in the Black River, and he had learned it too well. But Rowena was not Cicely. That was the thing he came to understand, sitting alone with the ledgers he did not read. Cicely had been sunlight, all surface and dazzle, loving him never and no one long. Rowena was something deeper and quieter and stronger, a woman who had been broken and had not broken, who had lost everything and kept her honor and her wit and her straight back, who read Cowper and grew roses and laughed at his stubbornness over a dead poet's verse. He had not loved Cicely, he understood at last. He had loved the idea of being loved by so bright a creature. What he felt for the woman digging in his ruined garden was another thing entirely, and it had crept up on him so quietly that it had put down roots before he ever knew it was there. He resolved to let a little of it show, not to press her, never that, but to stop standing quite so far off. To let her see in small ways that his gentleness was not indifference but its opposite, that he asked nothing not because he wanted nothing but because he wanted only what she could freely give. He began with the roses. They came in early May, a whole cart of them, bare-rooted and thorny, ordered under his own hand from the finest nursery in York, not the ordinary garden sorts, but the rare ones, the old damasks and the striped gallicas, and a white climber said to have come from a garden in Damascus 100 years before. He had them carried to the walled garden while she was out riding, for she rode now, on a gentle grey mare he had chosen for her, and he had taught her himself in the paddock, patient and unhurried, until she sat as easy as any lady in the county. And when she came in and found them, 60 rose plants standing in their damp straw against the south wall she had cleared for exactly this, she came to find him in the library with her cheeks flushed and her eyes very bright. "You bought me 100 roses," she said. There was something in her voice he had not heard from her before, not gratitude, which was the chilly thing his aunt had warned of, but a kind of wondering, unguarded joy. 60, he corrected. The man swore they were the finest in England, and charged me accordingly, so I shall expect a good deal of pleasure from them by way of return. He set down his pen. You cleared the south wall for climbers. It seemed a pity to leave the wall empty and the woman who wanted a garden all her life with only herbs to show for it. She stood in the doorway of the library, in her riding habit, with the May light behind her, and looked at him, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Then she crossed the room, she to him for the first time, and stopped before the desk, and said, in a low unsteady voice, "You keep giving me things and asking nothing, and I do not know what to do with it. No one has ever." She stopped, her hands twisted together. I keep waiting for the price. Every day I wait for it, and it never comes, and I'm beginning to think there is no price, and that frightens me more than a cruel husband would have, because I do not know how to be safe. I have forgotten how. I am not sure I ever knew. Adrian rose slowly from the desk. He did not come round it. He kept the width of the wood between them, because even now, even with her standing so close and so open, he would not crowd her. There is no price, he said quietly. There was never going to be a price. And you need not know how to be safe all at once. You need only let yourself begin to believe you are, a day at a time, a rose at a time, for as long as it takes. He looked at her steadily across the desk. I have all the time in the world, Rowena. I have nothing in this life but time and this house, and now, if you should ever come to wish it, and not 1 hour before you, I will wait as long as you need. That is not a burden. It is the nearest thing to happiness I have known in 8 years. She looked at him with her grey eyes bright and swimming, and she did not answer, and she did not need to. She only reached across the desk, across the width of wood he had kept between them, and laid her small, garden-roughened hand over his and left it there, and it was the first thing she had ever freely given him, and Adrian Vane thought his heart would break of it, for gladness. There was a night, in that first tender spring, that Adrian would count ever after among the truest of his life, though nothing happened in it that the world would have thought worth the counting. It was late in April, and one of his black moods had come down on him without warning, out of a clear day, the way they always came. He had been well enough in the morning, had ridden out, had watched her at her roses, had felt the strange new gladness of the season. And then at some point in the afternoon a letter had come, an ordinary letter of business from his solicitor, and in it a line, a single careless line, mentioning that the anniversary of the late unhappy event was near, and would his grace wish the usual arrangements made at the parish church. The usual arrangements, a wreath, a prayer, 8 years of usual arrangements for a girl he had failed. The mood came down on him like a shutter, and he went to ground the way a wounded animal goes to ground, and he shut himself in his study, and would see no one, and answered Mrs. Poole through the door that he wanted nothing, no dinner, nothing, only to be let alone. He heard, some hours later in the dark, a soft knock. He did not answer it. He expected it to go away, as such knocks always went away. The servants had learned in 8 years to leave him to his blackness. It did not go away. Instead the door opened. She had not asked his leave, and he marked even in his misery that it was the first time she had crossed a threshold of his without it. And Rowena came quietly into the dark study with a single candle, and did not speak, and did not put on more light, and did not ask him what was wrong or tell him he must eat or any of the 100 well-meant things that would have driven him further into the dark. She only came and set the candle down and sat herself in the chair on the other side of the cold hearth, a little apart, with her work-basket, and took out some mending and began in the small pool of candlelight, quietly to sew. Adrian watched her from the shadows, from the depths of his black mood, and for a long while said nothing, and she said nothing, and the only sound in the room was the small whisper of her needle through the cloth. "You need not sit with me," he said at last, roughly. "I am poor company when I am like this. I am no company at all. Anyone. It is best I am let alone." "I know you think so," Rowena said, not looking up from her work. "You have been let alone for 8 years, and it has not mended you, so I do not think much of the remedy." She drew the thread through. "I am not here to talk you out of it, Adrian, nor to jolly you, nor to ask you what black thing has got its claws in you tonight, though I can guess. I am only here because I have sat alone in the dark with a grief too many nights of my own life, and I have learned that the thing one wants is not to be talked to and not to be left alone, but only to have another warm soul in the room, sewing, saying nothing, so that the dark is not quite so entirely one's own. That is all. You may go on brooding as long as you like. I have a great deal of mending, and I am comfortable, and I shall not say a word." And she did not. She sat there in the small light and sewed, and Adrian sat in his shadow with his grief, and the strangest thing happened, the thing he had not known could happen. The mood did not lift, exactly, but it grew bearable. The presence of her, warm and quiet and undemanding across the dead hearth, took some of the terrible aloneness out of the dark, and after a long while, an hour, perhaps 2, he found that the claws had loosened, and that he could breathe, and that the thing which had felt like drowning felt now only like sorrow, which is a thing a man can live with, if he is not made to live with it alone. "It is the anniversary," he said at last into the quiet, and she looked up then, and her face was very gentle in the candlelight, and she set down her sewing but did not come to him, did not crowd him, only listened. "Off Cecily, 8 years. My man wrote to ask about the wreath, the usual arrangements. I have made the usual arrangements 8 times, and every year it opens the whole of it again, the river, the reeds, the weight of her, and every year I have borne it alone, in this room, in the dark, because there was no one, and because I did not think I deserved anything but to bear it alone." He looked at her across the small light. "And tonight there is someone, and I do not know what to do with that. I have forgot how it is done to have someone." "You are doing it," Rowena said softly. "This is how it is done. You let me sit in the room. That is the whole of it. There is no more to learn." And she took up her sewing again and let him be, and stayed until the candle was low and his breathing had eased, and only then did she rise and gather her basket and pause at the door. "I will make the arrangements this year, if you will let me," she said. "The wreath, the prayer. Let me take that one small weight off you. It should not always be yours to carry, and I do not mind it." She was a girl who came to grief young, and was betrayed and frightened, and I know a little of how that feels. I would be glad to lay a wreath for her, if her memory would not mind a stranger's hands. She hesitated. "And I would be glad, if you would let me, to go with you to the church." Adrian looked at her across the dying candlelight, this woman he had married in dread 3 weeks before, who had walked without his leave into the darkest room of his life and made it, simply by sitting in it, bearable. And he understood, with a certainty that steadied something in him for good, that whatever he had told himself about debts cancelled and freedom granted and asking nothing, he was already, entirely and past all undoing, in love with her. "I would let you do anything in the world," he said very low. "That is the trouble I have got myself into, Duchess. I would let you do anything at all." She smiled in the doorway, in the last of the candle. "Then let me do this," she said. "Good night, Adrian. Sleep if you can. And if you cannot," she nodded at the chair where she had sat. "You know the door is not locked on either side of it, and never will be. You need only knock." She went out. Adrian Vane sat a long while alone in the dark that was no longer quite so dark, and then, for the first time in 8 years, he did not spend the anniversary of Cecily's death in solitude at all. He went to the church the next day with his wife on his arm, and stood at the modest stone with the wreath Rowena had made of early roses, from the plants they had set together only weeks before, the first blooms of the garden she had brought back to life. And he found that the old grief, laid down at last in company in daylight, with a warm hand in his, weighed a very great deal less than it had ever weighed alone. The peace of that spring was not to last, and Adrian, who had learned long ago to distrust his own happiness, was almost not surprised when it broke. It broke in the shape of a letter, and then a visitor, and then a whole gathering summoned to Denmore against his inclination by the iron will of his Aunt Bramwell, who had decided that the Duke and his new Duchess had hidden themselves away from the world quite long enough and must now be shown to it. There would be talk, she said, if they did not. There was talk already. Half the county believed he kept the poor girl a prisoner. The other half believed she had wed a madman and repented of it. And the only cure for both, Lady Bramwell declared, was to fling open the great doors of Denmore, give a proper dinner and a ball, and let society see with its own eyes a Duke and Duchess perfectly content. "I am not perfectly content to be gaped at," Adrian said. "Nor, I think, is she." "Content has nothing to do with it," said his aunt. "You have a wife who deserves to take her rightful place, and a name that has lain under a shadow long enough, and a chance to end the shadow. And you will take it, or I will know the reason why. Do you wish her to be whispered of as the mad Duke's captive for the rest of her days? Or do you wish to walk her into a ballroom on your arm, and let every cat in the county see that she is a duchess in her own right and glad of it?" Put so, he could not refuse. And when he laid it before Rowena, for he would decide nothing that touched her without laying it before her, that was become the rule of his life, she was quiet a while, and then she lifted her chin in the old brave way and said, "I would rather face them than hide from them." If I am to be your duchess, let me be it in the open. I am done with corners." So the doors of Denmore were flung open, and the invitations went out, and the county came. Among those who came was a man Adrian had hoped never to see under his roof again, Sir Julian Crail of Crail Hall, a smooth, fair, handsome gentleman of Adrian's own age, whose lands marched with Denmore's along the western boundary, and whose enmity with the Vanes went back 2 generations, to a disputed water meadow and a lawsuit their fathers had fought to the death of both purses. Crail had never forgiven the Vanes for winning the meadow. He had a courtier's manners and a gambler's smile and a way of speaking ill of a man so gracefully that the man was insulted a full minute before he knew it, and he had done more than any other single person, Adrian had long believed, to spread and gild the darkest of the tales about the North Wing. Crail had wanted Cecily Marchmont once, in the old days. Crail had never quite let it be forgotten that Cecily had drowned rather than marry the Duke. He came to the ball uninvited, as invited by Lady Brumwell in her sweeping generosity, over Adrian's objection, on the grounds that to snub a neighbour would only feed the talk, and he came, Adrian saw, within the first quarter hour with a purpose. The purpose was Rowena. Adrian watched it unfold across the crowded, candle-blazing length of his own ballroom with a cold, mounting anger that he held, with great effort, in check. Crail singled her out. He was charming to her, and attentive and clever, and he told her. Adrian could not hear the words, but he could read the shape of the conversation as plainly as print. The old stories. He watched Crail lean close over the punch, all easy sympathy, and saw Rowena's face change. Saw the ease she had won so slowly over the spring begin to close again into the wary stillness of March, and he understood that Crail was doing the one thing that could most surely wound them both. He was pouring the poison of the county back into her ear, the tale of the drowned bride, the mad Duke, the woman who chose the Black River over the marriage bed. Adrian crossed the room. He did it without haste, greeting 3 people on the way, for he would not give the watching county the spectacle of a jealous husband storming across a ballroom, but he crossed it, and came to her side, and set his hand lightly at the small of her back, the first time he had touched her so in company, and he felt her start beneath it, and then, to his everlasting relief, lean the smallest degree into the touch rather than away. "Crail," he said pleasantly, "I did not know you cared for dancing, or had you come to inspect the water meadow? I hear the drainage is much improved." Crail's smile did not waver. "I came to pay my respects to the Duchess," he said smoothly. One had heard so much and seen so little. "I confess I had begun to fear the reports that she was kept close, poor lady, but I find her in excellent looks and excellent spirits." His pale eyes flicked to Rowena and back. "We were speaking of Denmore's history. Such a house, so many stories in it." "I was telling the Duchess of the North Wing, but perhaps she knows all that already. A wife would surely by now. Or does the door stay locked even to her?" It was expertly done. It laid the whole ugly legend at Rowena's feet and made a mystery of Adrian's silence in the same breath, and did it so smoothly that no one 3 feet away would have caught the malice in it. Adrian felt the old cold fury rise in him, the fury that had, once or twice in his younger years, made him the man the county thought him. He mastered it. He had promised himself he would never again let Julian Crail draw that man out of him. "The North Wing is shut because it holds nothing but dust and old grief," Adrian said evenly, "and I have never seen the profit in dwelling among either. You are welcome to inspect it, Crail, if dust and grief are to your taste." "I recall they generally are." A ripple of quiet laughter from those near enough to hear. Crail's smile tightened by a hair. "As for what my wife knows whatever she wishes to know, when she wishes to know it from me and not from a neighbour with a 2-generation grudge and a talent for graveyard tales. Now, I believe the musicians are striking up, and I mean to dance with the Duchess, if she will do me the honour. You will forgive us." He turned to Rowena and offered his hand, formally in the old way, and there was a question in it plain to her if to no one else. "Will you?" He had never demanded a thing of her, and he would not demand this, not even to spite Crail, not even before the whole watching county. If she wished to plead a headache and withdraw, he would take her from the room himself and let them talk. But Rowena looked at him, really looked, past the noise and the candles and the poison Crail had poured into his face, and something steadied in her, and she laid her hand in his. "The honor is mine, your grace," she said clearly, so that all around might hear it, and let him lead her out onto the floor. They danced. He was a good dancer, though he had not danced in years, and she matched him, and for the length of dance the ballroom of Denmore blazed and turned about them, and they moved through it together, the mad duke and his rescued bride, and it was not at all the picture the county had come to see. He held her at the correct distance, his gloved hand light at her waist, and he did not speak until the figures of the dance brought them close, and then, low, under the music, he said, "Whatever he told you, ask me, and I will tell you the truth of it, tonight, tomorrow, whenever you wish. I have kept it long because it is a grief and not a secret, but I will not have Julian Crail telling you my life before I have. Ask me, Rowena. I would rather you had the truth of it from me, even at the cost of watching me flinch." She was quite a turn of the dance. Then she said softly, "He told me your betrothed drowned herself sooner than marry you, that the north wing is her rooms, kept as a shrine, that you have loved a dead woman for 8 years and shut yourself away with her ghost, and that any living wife of yours would only ever be a placeholder for a corpse." Her voice did not shake, but her hand tightened in his. I did not believe the cruelty of the way he said it. But I do not know how much of the rest is true, and I have been afraid this last hour that I have given my regard to a man who was only ever waiting to grieve someone else. The dance turned them apart and back together, and Adrian looked down into her steady, frightened grey eyes, and he made a decision that he had been 8 years in the making. "Come to the north wing tomorrow," he said, "with me. And I will show you what is behind the locked door, all of it, and tell you the whole truth, which no living soul has heard, and then you may judge for yourself what manner of man you have married, and whether you wish to go on being married to him. I will not have Crail's version stand. And I will not," his voice roughened just slightly, and he saw her mark it, "I will not have you believe that you are a placeholder for anyone. Whatever else is true, that is a lie, and the cruelest one he told you. Come tomorrow, and I will prove it." The music ended. They stood a moment on the floor amid the applause and the fans and the watching eyes, and Rowena Vane looked up at her husband, and slowly, deliberately, she rose on her toes and did what no one in that ballroom had expected, what the county would speak of for a month. She kissed him once, lightly, on the cheek in full view of them all, a small, deliberate, public claiming, and then stepped back and said, in a voice pitched to carry, "I should be glad to your grace." Across the room, Sir Julian Crail's handsome face had gone quite still. Adrian met his eyes over his wife's fair head and did not smile, and did not need to. The look was enough. He came for her the next morning after breakfast, when the house was quiet and the guests who had stayed the night were still abed, and he led her through the long galleries to the door at the end of the north corridor that had not been opened in 8 years. The key was old and stiff and cold in his hand. He had carried it in his breast pocket for so long that its shape was worn into the memory of his fingers, but he had not turned it in the lock since the autumn Cecily died, and for a moment, standing before the tall dark door with Rowena silent at his side, he was not sure his hand would obey him. Then it did. The lock gave with a groan, and the door swung inward on a breath of stale, cold, undisturbed air, and Adrian Vane stepped back into the past. The rooms beyond were as they had been left. A sitting room, a bedchamber, a small boudoir, all hung in the pale blue silks that Cecily had chosen for herself in the eager weeks before the wedding, faded now and grey with dust, cobwebbed at the corners of the mirrors. Furniture stood shrouded in holland covers. On a dressing table, laid out as if for a woman who would come to sit at it any moment, were a silver-backed brush, a scent bottle gone to sludge, a pair of long gloves. And over the cold hearth hung a portrait, a laughing fair girl in a white gown, painted the summer of the betrothal, forever young, forever bright. Rowena stood very still in the doorway and looked at it all, and said nothing, and waited. Her name was Cecily, Adrian said. His voice sounded strange to him in the shut air of that room, hoarse as though he had not used it in years, which in a sense he had not for this. Cecily Marchmont. I was 30. She was 21, and the brightest thing I had ever seen, and I mistook that brightness for a great deal it was not. I asked her father for her, and he gave her to me before she was well consulted, for he wanted the match, and I wanted her, and neither of us thought to ask the girl herself what she wanted. That was my first great sin against her, though I did not know it then. I did not ask her leave. I only wanted her. He walked slowly into the room among the shrouded furniture and stopped before the portrait and made himself look up at the painted, laughing face he had not let himself look at in 8 years. She did not want me. She wanted a lieutenant named Ashford, a poor man, a charming one, and she accepted me because her father wished it and because she was young and could not see any way to refuse. I never knew. I thought, God help me, I thought she loved me, because I loved her, and a loving man is the easiest fool in the world to make. He drew a slow breath. On the night before the wedding she ran. Not to Ashford. He had thrown her over the week before, when he learned her father would settle nothing on her if she crossed him. So she was betrayed on both sides, poor child, by the man she loved and the man she was to marry, and she could not bear either of us. She ran out into a bad night, a storm, the river up over the ford. I think I have had 8 years to think it, and I believe that she meant only to run, to get away, to reach the coach road and be gone. I do not believe she meant to die. But the ford was flooded, and it was dark, and she did not know the water as I know it, and she went off the causeway at Denmore Bridge, and the river took her. Rowena had come into the room. He heard her step behind him, but he did not turn. He could not yet, not with the words finally coming after so long damned. I searched all that night, he said. The whole household did, and the tenants their lanterns, up and down banks. Was I who found her, near dawn, 3 miles down, caught in the reeds below the mill. I carried her out of the water with my own hands. She was so light. I had not known a person could be so light. His voice broke finally on that, the thing he had never said aloud, and he stood before the painted laughing face and let it break. I have never told anyone that I found her. The county says I drove her to the river. I let them say it. It was easier than the truth, which is that I loved a woman who never loved me and did not see it. By not seeing it, by wanting her and never once asking whether she wanted me, I helped to build the trap that killed her. Crail is right that I've lived among ghosts. He is wrong about which ghost. I do not grieve a lover lost. I grieve a girl I frightened and failed and never knew, and my own blindness that helped to drown her. That is what is behind the locked door, Rowena, not a shrine to a great love. A monument to a great blindness that I could not bring myself to look at, and could not bring myself to destroy, because to change these rooms would be to pretend the wrong away, and I did not think I had the right. The silence in the shut room was very deep. Dust hung in the single bar of morning light that fell through a gap in the shutters. Then he felt her hand on his arm, turning him gently away from the portrait, and he let himself be turned, and looked down into her face, and found there not the horror he had braced for, nor the pity he could not have borne, but something graver and steadier and infinitely kinder. "That is why," she said softly, "that is why you ask my leave in everything, why you have never once in 3 months asked a thing of me I did not give. It is not only honor, it is penance. You are so afraid of taking what is not freely given that you have made a rule of your whole life of it, because once you took a woman who was never yours to take, and it destroyed her." Adrian could not speak. She had seen, in a moment, to the very bottom of him, the thing it had taken him 8 years even to look at, and named it more truly than he had ever dared name it to himself. "You did not drown her, Adrian," Rowena went on, and her hand tightened on his arm. "A frightened girl and a flooded river drowned her. You were blind, as young men in love are blind, and that is a fault. But it is not a murder, and you have punished yourself for a murder you did not do for 8 years in a locked room. Her father who sold her, the man who threw her over, the storm, the ford, you have taken all their guilt onto yourself and carried alone in the dark and called it justice. It is not justice. It is only grief with nowhere to go." Her voice gentled further. "Let it go somewhere now. Let it come out of this room and into the light, where it can heal, instead of festering behind a locked door for another 8 years. You do not owe that poor girl a lifetime of penance. You owe her only that you learn the thing her death might teach, to ask and to wait, and to let a woman be free, and you have learned it. You learned it so well you have half frightened me with your gentleness, waiting and never reaching, so that I began to think you did not want me at all. I want you," Adrian said, and the words came out of him rough and low and utterly stripped of everything but truth. I have wanted you since I stood in the doorway of a ruined library and watched you argue over a Virgil. I did not reach because I did not dare, because the last time I reached for a woman without her leave, she died of it, and I swore I would never again make a woman feel taken. But I want you, Rowena, God knows I want you, and not as a placeholder for any ghost. There is no ghost in you. You are the most alive thing I have ever. He stopped. He made himself say the last of it, the thing he had never once let himself say, in this room least of all. I love you. I love you as I never loved her, because I know you, which I never did her. And I have not said it all these weeks, because I would not have you feel that my love was one more debt you must repay. Even now I do not ask you to answer it. I could not let Creel's lie stand, nor stand any longer in this room and not tell you the truth of my whole heart. For a long moment Rowena said nothing at all. The dust turned in the light. The painted girl laughed down at them both from the cold wall, forever young. Then Rowena reached up and laid her hand along his jaw, the first time she had ever touched his face, and drew him down, and kissed him, not the light-claiming kiss of the ballroom, but a true one, slow and warm and freely given. And against his mouth she said the words he had waited 3 months and 8 years and half a lifetime to hear. I love you too, she said, and it is not a debt, and it is not gratitude, whatever your aunt fears. It is the freest thing I have ever chosen. I chose it a rose at a time, exactly as you said, until there was no more waiting left to do. She drew back the smallest space and looked at him, her grey eyes shining. Now take me out of this poor sad room, Adrian, and lock it, and let us give her the only thing that is left to give her, an end to the grieving. And then let us open every other door in this house and begin to truly live in it, together. As we were never made to marry, and as we have somehow, against everything, become. He did. He drew the door of the north wing shut behind them, and turned the old key in the lock a last time, and this time it did not feel like a wound closing over, but like a wound at last cleaned. And he put the key in his pocket, and drew his wife's hand through his arm, and led her back down the long gallery into the light of the living house, and behind them the pale blue rooms and the laughing portrait, and the 8 years of grief were left, at last. In the peace they had so long been denied, in the weeks between the opening of the north wing and the harvest, before Julian Creel's malice broke upon them, there was a stretch of high summer that Adrian would remember all his life as the pure gold of it, the untroubled heart of the year, when nothing threatened them yet, and everything they had won so slowly was simply, quietly theirs. They rode out together most fine mornings, up onto the high moor where the heather was coming into its purple, and the larks went up out of the grass. And Adrian showed the country he had ridden alone for 8 years. The old drove roads, the standing stone the shepherds called the Grey Wife, the hidden valley where the peregrines nested, and it was a different country shared than had ever been alone. He had thought the moor his one true companion in the bad years, the one thing that asked nothing of him, and he found now that had only ever been a substitute for the thing he had not dared to want, a companionship without the risk of being known. And that to ride it beside a woman who laughed at the wind and named the birds, and reined in of her own accord to sit her horse in silence beside him watching light move across the fells, that was worth more than 8 years of solitary miles, and made the solitary miles seem, in the remembering, unbearably lonely. You loved it out here alone, Rowena said to him once on such a morning, when they had halted at the crest above the hidden valley. It was not quite a question. I told myself I did, Adrian said. I told myself a great many things in those years, most of them to keep from having to feel the true one, which was that I was lonely past bearing and had decided to call it peace. He looked out over the fells, golden purple and running with cloud shadow. It is a strange thing, Rowena. I did not know I was unhappy. That is the worst of it, looking back. A man can be so long unhappy that he forgets the taste of the other thing entirely, and mistakes the mere absence of fresh pain for contentment, and builds his whole life around protecting that grey nothing, and calls himself, if you had asked him, perfectly well. He turned to her. I know the difference now. That is your doing. You have ruined me for the grey nothing forever. I could not go back to it now if the whole world required it of me. I have remembered what the other thing tastes like, and I would rather have it and risk the losing than never taste it again. She reached across the small space between their horses and took his hand, and they sat so a while, hand in hand on horseback in the wind, above the whole gold country, and it was, Adrian thought, as near to perfect happiness as he had ever come or ever expected to. In the evenings that summer they read together still, as they had from the first, but it was a different thing now too. She would sit not across the library but beside him, tucked against his side on the long window seat where the last light came in, and they would take a book between them and read it turn about aloud, her voice and then his, the way he thought once and did not say it, for it was too tender even for him, the way a family reads. She read him the poets she loved, and he read her the naturalists his father had collected, the patient, old volumes on birds and beetles and the ways of rivers, and she teased him for his passion for such dry stuff, and then found, to her own surprise, that she was moved by it, by the sheer attention of it. A man of 100 years before lying on his belly by a stream day after day simply to learn the truth of how a trout takes a fly. You are like them, she told him one such evening, closing the old book on her finger, those patient men. That is what you are, Adrian, under all the fearsome reputation. Patient watcher who wants only to learn the true shape of a thing without disturbing it. It is why you were so gentle with me, that first spring. You watched, and you waited, and you never once put out a hand to grasp, for fear of frightening the thing you were watching. You courted me exactly as your father's naturalists courted their kingfishers, by being so still and so patient and asking so little that, in the end, the wild, shy creature came to you of its own accord and lit upon your hand. He was quiet a moment, turning it over, for she had a way of seeing him that no one ever had, that showed him to himself. "And are you glad you lit?" he asked at last, low. "I am the gladdest fool in 3 counties," she said, and leaned up and kissed him, and they did not finish the chapter that night, nor did either of them mind. It could not last untroubled, of course. Nothing golden ever does, and Julian Crail was already sharpening his malice a few miles off across the boundary. But Adrian did not know that yet, in the gold heart of that summer, and it was as well that he did not, for it let him have the whole sweet, untroubled length of it, unshadowed, to keep forever after against the dark that was coming. He would need it. There is a kind of happiness that a man stores up in the good weeks against the bad, the way a house lays in wood against the winter, and Adrian laid in that summer the way a wise man lays in fuel, and when the black August night came at the ford, and the cold river, and Crail's smiling murder. It was the memory of these gold mornings on the moor, and these gold evenings on the window seat that steadied him, that reminded him precisely what he was fighting the river for, that put the strength in his arms to haul a would-be murderer out of the black water, and come home, dripping and alive. To the woman who had taught him a rose and a book and a patient hour at a time, that his broken life was worth the saving after all. The summer that followed was the happiest Adrian had ever known, and he knew it even as he lived it, which is a rare grace and one he did not take for granted. They were, in every way that had waited so long, truly married now. He did not describe it even to himself in any but the plainest terms. The door between their rooms stood open of an evening. The east and west wings of the great house were no longer 2 countries but one. He woke, more mornings than not, with his wife's fair head on the pillow beside his, and thought each time, with a wonder that did not fade, that he had somehow been given more than a man of his history had any right to expect. The roses came on along the south wall, damask and gallica, and the white Damascus climber, and filled the walled garden with a scent that reached even into the house on warm evenings, and Rowena moved through those days brown and glad with her sleeves turned back, and the servants who had feared her now plainly loved her. And Denmore Court, which had been for 8 years a mausoleum, was become a home. The county talked, of course, but it talked differently now. The tale of the mad duke and his captive bride could not survive the sight of a duke and duchess riding out together laughing, or the fact, carried everywhere by servants and tenants, who cannot be stopped from talking and should never be, that his grace asked her grace's leave in everything and deferred to her judgment and looked at her, as Lady Bramwell had said, the way a starving man looks at bread. Slowly the story changed shape. He was no longer the murderer of Denmore. It was murmured, a man who had grieved a great sorrow and been healed by a good woman, and that is a story a county likes far better, being warmer and more used at a dinner table, and so it took hold and the old lie began at last to die. All of it enraged Sir Julian Crail. Adrian saw the danger and did not fully credit it, which was his one great error of that golden summer. He knew Crail hated him. He had known it for 20 years, but he had thought of Crail as a spreader of poison, a man who fought with whispers and a smooth tongue at a ball, and he had not reckoned that a man so wounded in his vanity, for Crail had wanted Cicely once, and been passed over, and had built a whole identity on being the man who knew the Duke's dark secret, might be driven to something worse than whispers when the whispers stopped working. The first sign came in July. A rumour began to move through the county, subtle and vicious, that the new Duchess not what she seemed, that Rowena Fairley had not been the innocent, ruined gentlewoman she appeared, but a schemer who had deliberately entangled the Duke, who had known of the debts and played upon his guilt, who had trapped a grieving man into marriage for his fortune. It was clever, because it was the inversion of the truth, and because it took the very tenderness of their story and turned it into evidence of her cunning. Adrian traced it within a week to Crail Hall. He said nothing to Rowena at first. He did not wish to frighten her, and he had learned from Cicely, from all of it, that a man who tries to manage a woman's knowledge for her own good is only another kind of gaoler. So instead he told her plainly, one evening in the garden among the roses, exactly what was being said and where it came from, and asked her how she wished to meet it. She was quiet a while, deadheading a spent damask with her clever fingers. "He cannot hurt us with it," she said at last, "unless we let it make us hide again. That is what he wants, to drive us back behind locked doors, back to being the mad Duke and his shut-away bride, 'cause that is the only version of you he can feel superior to. The cure is the same as it was at the ball. We do not hide. We live in the open gladly until the lie starves." She looked up at him. "But I think, Adrian, that a man who has moved from whispers to lies may in time move from lies to something worse, if the lies fail too. I do not say this to frighten you. I say it because I have learned the hard way that the men who cannot bear to lose grow most dangerous exactly when they are losing. Watch him. Do not turn your back on Julian Crail." She was right, and Adrian, who had spent 8 years underestimating no one but himself, took the warning to heart. But even he did not guess how far Crail would go. It came to its head in August at the harvest, and it came through the thing Adrian loved best, which is always how such men strike. There was an old dispute, older even than the water meadow over the western boundary of Denmore's lands, where they met Crails along the course of the river, the very river that had drowned Cicely, the Denmore water that Adrian knew as he knew his own hand. In a dry summer the river ran low and the boundary was easily kept, but there had been talk that summer of Crail diverting a feeder stream to fill a new ornamental lake he was digging, a scheme that would, if carried out, choke the flow through Denmore's water meadows and ruin the second hay. Adrian had ridden out several times to the boundary to see for himself, and had found Crail's men at work on a channel that would plainly do exactly what was feared, and had sent Crail a cold, correct letter warning him off. Crail's reply was to invite the Duke and Duchess to Crail Hall, to a great harvest home he was giving, to settle the matter. He wrote as neighbours and gentlemen over the boundary itself so that all might be seen and agreed in the open. It was, on its face, a gesture of peace. Rowena did not like it. "He does not make peace," she said, reading the letter over Adrian's shoulder. "He has never in his life made peace. This is a hook with a piece on the end of it. Do not go." "If I do not go," Adrian said slowly, "he will say the mad Duke is too proud or too guilty or too afraid to face his neighbour over an honest dispute, and the boundary must be settled, or I lose the water meadow, and with it a good part of the estate's income and 100 years of Denmore right. I must go." But he covered her hand with his. "I will go carefully, and I will not go alone, and I will keep to open ground and daylight and witnesses, and I will not put my back to Julian Crail for one moment, and you, my love, will not come, not this once. I ask it of you, one of the few things I have ever asked, because the one certain way to wound me now is through you, and I will not carry you into his reach. Stay at Denmore. Keep the doors open and the garden growing, and let all the county see the Duchess living gladly at home. That is the surest proof against his lies. Will you grant it?" She did not like it, but she granted it, because he had asked so little of her in all their marriage that she could not refuse the one true thing he asked. "Come home to me," she said, at the door, her hands fisted in the front of his coat. whatever else. Come home to me, Adrian. I did not learn to be alive again to bury you in that river within the year. I will come home to you, he said, and kissed her, and meant it with his whole heart, and rode for Crail Hall in the bright August morning with 3 of his own men behind him and a cold, waiting wariness in his chest. The harvest home was in full swing when he arrived, trestles on the lawn, ale and beef, Crail's tenants and his own mingling fiddlers, the smell of cut wheat on the warm air. Crail received him with every appearance of open, hearty welcome, and walked him about the festivities, all bluff good humour. Adrian played the part in turn, correct and cool, and waited for the thing beneath the welcome to show itself. It showed itself after the eating, when Crail proposed that they ride out together to the disputed boundary, just the 2 of them and their stewards, to walk the ground and settle the line, gentleman to gentleman, before witnesses could be found to sign whatever was agreed. Just the 2 of us, Crail said with his gambler's smile, and our men, of course. I would not have you think I mean anything but fairness, Denmore. We have been enemies too long, you and I, over a little water. Let us end it today. And Adrian, who had promised Rowena he would not put his back to Julian Crail, looked into that smiling face and knew with a cold certainty that the trap was here, that the whole harvest home had been staged around this moment, and that if he refused now he would confirm every tale of the coward and the madman before 100 witnesses, and if he went he would be riding out to the very river that had already taken one thing he loved, with a man who hated him at his side. He went. There was, in the end, no other road that did not run through his own fear, and he had spent too long a prisoner of that already. But before he mounted he sent one of his 3 men quietly back toward Denmore with a message for the Duchess, that he loved her, that he went carefully, and that if he were not home by dark she should send to the magistrate at once and tell him where the Duke had gone and with whom. He did not yet know how much would turn upon that single, careful precaution, but he had learned, in a hard school, to leave a lantern burning against the dark. And so he rode out toward the boundary and the low August river, with Julian Crail smiling at his side, into the last and worst hours of the long summer. The boundary lay a mile from Crail Hall, where the land fell away in a long slope of stubble to the river and the disputed water meadows beyond. They rode out in the late gold of the afternoon, the 4 of them, Adrian and Crail ahead, their 2 stewards behind, and the fiddles and the shouting of the harvest home faded away at their backs until there was only the wind in the stubble and the low glinting river ahead. Adrian marked, as they went, that they were riding not toward the boundary stone but downstream of it, toward the ford and the old causeway where the river ran deep and fast between steep banks, the very ford a mile or so below Denmore Bridge, where in the old days the drovers had crossed and where, 3 miles further down, Cicely had gone into the reeds. He marked too that Crail's steward was not a steward. He was a heavy, silent man Adrian had seen before at the fringes of the harvest home, a bruiser with a broken nose, and he had drifted without seeming to, so that he now rode between Adrian's own man and Adrian, cutting them apart. The line runs through the ford, I think you'll find, Crail was saying pleasantly, and your fathers were wrong to claim the whole of the meadow. Come down to the water and I'll show you where the true march lies. It is easiest seen from the bank itself. Adrian did not move his horse toward the bank. He stopped it on the high ground in the open, in the last of the daylight, and let his hand rest quiet on his rein, and looked at Julian Crail with a cold, clear steadiness. I think, he said, that the line lies exactly where the survey of 1783 set it, along the old boundary oak, which is a 1/4 mile behind us, and which you have very carefully not ridden me to. I think there is no honest business at this ford at all. And I think, Crail, that you have brought me down to the deepest and fastest water on either of our lands at dusk, with a hired bruiser at my flank, and my 1 man cut off from me, and I would very much like to hear you say what it is you truly mean to do, before you do it, as one gentleman to another, since you set such store by the word. Crail's smile did not fall so much as change. The bluff good humour ran out of it like water out of a cracked jug, and what was left underneath was older and colder and uglier, 20 years of a nursed and rotting grievance. You took the meadow, he said softly. Your father took the meadow, and won the lawsuit, and beggared mine, and my father died of it, cursing your name. You took Cecily, she was mine, she was all but promised me before your father dangled his dukedom in front of hers, and you took her. And then you drowned her, and I have had to stand by for 8 years and watch you play the tragic grieving lord while every soul in the county knew what you truly were, because I told them. And now have gone and got yourself healed, a wife, roses. The county turning soft on you, calling it a love story. You do not get to be forgiven, Denmore. Not you. I have spent my whole life being the man who knew the truth about you, and I will not have you take even that from me. If the river will not do its own work, I shall have to help it. The mad Duke of Denmore, drowned at the same ford as his poor bride, in the black grip of his old grief. Even you must admit it is fitting. The county will believe it in a heartbeat. They have believed everything else I told them. He nodded once to the broken-nosed man, and the man kicked his horse forward and reached for Adrian's bridle to drag him down toward the water. Adrian had spent 8 years being the man the county called a monster, and he had spent that whole time proving he was not, but he had not. In becoming gentle, become weak, and Julian Crail had made the last error of underestimating a man who had ridden the boundaries of Denmore since he was a boy, and knew every foot of that river better than any living soul. Adrian did not let the man reach his bridle. He wheeled his horse hard into the bruiser's mount, shoulder to shoulder, and the man, off balance and no horseman, went sideways down the steep bank with a shout and a great splash into the deep fast water, and then in an instant the whole shape of Crail's plot turned against its maker. For the river that was meant to drown the Duke had a Crail's hired man in it instead, floundering and going under, unable to swim, carried off downstream in the failing light. And Adrian, who had promised a frightened woman in a locked room that he had learned what Cecily's death might teach, Adrian did the thing that told the whole truth of the man he had become. He did not ride away and let the river do to Crail's creature what Crail had meant it to do to him. He flung himself from his horse and down the bank and into the black water after a man who had come there to murder him, because he was Adrian Vane and he had pulled one body from that river already, and he would not, while he had breath, leave another to it. The cold closed over him like a fist. The current was brutal, far stronger than it looked from the bank, and the light was nearly gone. And for a few endless moments there was nothing in the world but the river and the drowning weight of the man he had caught by the collar, and the desperate labor of his own arms fighting for the bank. He got a hand to a root. He got the man's head above the water. He hauled and slipped and hauled again, and his shoulder wrenched and his lungs burned, and the dark river tried, as it had tried once before, to take everything. And then there were hands above him, his own man's hands, and his steward's, and Crail's steward too, the real one, who had come down at the shouting and would not stand by for murder. And together they dragged Adrian and the half-drowned bruiser up the streaming bank and onto the solid ground, and the river was cheated of both of them. Julian Crail had not moved to help. He sat his horse on the high ground in the last grey light, and watched the man he had meant to make a murderer risk his own life to save a would-be assassin, and something in his face, Adrian saw when at last he stood dripping and gasping on the bank, had broken past all mending. For there is nothing so unanswerable to a man who has built his life on another's villainy as to watch that other prove, past all denying, before witnesses good. You could have let him drown, Crail said. His voice had gone strange, small. You could have let him drown and been rid of the whole matter, and no one would ever have known. I would have known, Adrian said. He stood streaming and shaking with cold and effort, and he had never in his life spoken with more quiet authority. That is the only judge that has ever mattered, Crail, and you have spent your life so busy managing what the county knew that you forgot it. You wanted a monster. I was very nearly one, once, in my grief and my pride. You are not wrong that the younger man might have done a black thing. But I have been given a chance to become another man than that, and I took it, and I will not throw it into the river to spite you. Your man is alive. You will answer to the magistrate for this night. My steward saw it, and yours, and my own man carries well ready to Denmore and thence to the bench. It is over, Julian. The lie is over. You have made a murder of no one but yourself, and you have proved before 4 witnesses exactly which of us is the monster of Denmore. Now get down off that horse and help your man to a fire before he dies of the cold, and let that be the one decent thing you do this year. And Julian Crail, broken at last, got down off his horse. Adrian came home to Denmore near midnight, soaked and bruised and half-frozen, on a borrowed horse, and Rowena was at the door before he had crossed the courtyard. For she had sent to the magistrate at dusk as he had bidden her, and had stood at the window every hour since with her heart in her mouth. She came down the steps into the torchlight and stopped a foot from him, taking in the wet ruin of him, the blood at his temple where a root had caught him. The exhaustion, and her face went white, and then flooded with such fierce relief that he thought, standing there dripping and shaking, that he had never seen anything so beautiful in all his life. "You came home to me," she said. "I told you I would." His teeth were chattering. He could barely stand. "I keep my word, Duchess. It is the one thing about me no one has ever called false." And Rowena Vane, who had once braced at an altar for the worst that a feared man could do to her, threw her arms around her drenched and shivering husband in the torchlight before the whole staring household, and held him as though she would never let the river or Julian Crail or any other thing in the world come near him again, and Adrian, safe at last, home at last, held her back with the last of his strength and let himself, for the first time in 8 years, be entirely and simply glad to be alive. They did not speak much that first night. Rowena drew him in out of the cold with her own hands, and would not leave him to the servants, and stripped the wet coat from his shoulders herself, and wrapped him in dry wool, and pressed hot broth on him before the great fire in his own rooms, chafing warmth back into his stiff blue hands and scolding him softly all the while in a voice that shook. And Adrian let her, which was itself a kind of miracle, for he had not let anyone tend him in 8 years. He had learned in a hard school to need no one. He unlearned a little of it that night, sitting by the fire with his wife's hands about his, and it was not weakness he felt in the unlearning, but something better and more difficult, a thing he had no ready word for and only slowly recognized as trust. "You went into the river after him," she said at last, when the shaking had gone out of him and the color had come back to his face. She was kneeling on the hearthrug at his knee, her fair head against his arm, and she said it not as a question but as a thing she was turning over, testing the enormous shape of it. "After the man who came to murder you. You could have ridden home to me and let the water take him, and no soul would have blamed you." "I would have blamed me," Adrian said, as he had said to Crail on the bank. He stroked her hair slowly, wondering at the softness of it, at the plain astonishing fact of her, warm and living against his side. "And I have spent 8 years being a man other men made up out of their own fear and cruelty. I did not fight so long to become myself, only to hand Julian Crail a true monster at the very end, to prove all his lies right after all. He built his whole life on my being wicked. I would not give him the satisfaction of being wicked, not even to save my own skin, and certainly not to take a life. Even his. He was quite a moment, the fire ticking, and there was the other thing, the old thing. I pulled Cecily out of that river with these hands, too late by hours, and I have dreamed of it 1,000 nights since. When I saw a man go into that same water before my eyes, alive, savable, Rowena, I could no more have ridden away and let the river win a second time than I could have stopped my own heart. It was not courage. It was the closest thing to laying a ghost that I will ever be given. I could not save her. I could save him. So I did." Rowena lifted her head and looked at him, and her grey eyes were wet, and she said very low, "Then she is laid. Do you understand me, Adrian? Whatever penance you thought you owed her, you paid it tonight in full in the same black water. You went back into the river that killed her, and this time you came out, and you brought a life out with you. It is finished. Let it be finished." And she reached up and touched his face, the cut at his temple, so gently, and Adrian bowed his head against her hand, and felt 8 years of a grief he had carried alone in a locked room finally, quietly, loosen its grip and let him go. The reckoning with Julian Crail came in the weeks that followed, and it was as complete as such reckonings ever are in this world, which is to say complete enough. The magistrate, old Sir Marcus Wetherby, a shrewd and upright man who had known Adrian's father and disliked him, and had watched the young Duke's transformation over the summer with a growing, grudging respect, took the depositions of 4 witnesses. Adrian's own man, Adrian's steward, Crail's own steward who had refused to stand by for murder, and the end most damning of all, the broken-nosed bruiser himself, who, once he understood that the Duke he had been hired to drown had gone into the river to save his worthless life, turned on his master with the whole ugly story and asked, weeping, whether it was true that his grace had really done such a thing. It was, of course, more than could be brought to a hanging. Quite, Crail had hired the deed, but not in the end accomplished it, and the man he hired lived, and the Duke lived, and the law in those days was a clumsy net that let a great many fish through. But it was more than enough to ruin Julian Crail. The story of it ran through the county faster than any lie he had ever planted, the true story, this time of how the man who had spent 20 years painting the Duke of Denmark a monster had lured him to the ford to drown him, and how the Duke had answered by pulling the murderer's own creature out of the water at the risk of his life. It was a story too good and too true and too exactly the shape the county now wished the world to be for anything to stop it, and it did to Julian Crail what nothing else had ever done. It made him ridiculous, and then it made him hated, and then it made him gone. He did not stand his trial. He sold Crail Hall that autumn quietly at a loss, to a manufacturing man from the north with more money than lineage, and he went abroad to the continent, to the sorts of watering places where a man with a shadow on his name and a little money left can lose himself among strangers. And he was never seen in the county again. The ornamental lake he had begun to dig, the one meant to choke Denmore's water meadows, was left half-finished and filled slowly with rain, and became in time a reedy pond where the herons stood, and no one remembered, within a few years, why it had ever been begun. Adrian felt, when the news came that Crail had gone, not the triumph he might once have expected, but something quieter and more like relief, and beneath the relief a strange, unlooked-for grain of pity. He said as much to Rowena, in the garden, among the roses of the year. He wanted Cicely once, truly in his way, Adrian said, and he lost her as I did, though he never had her to lose. And then he built his whole self out of the loss and the grudge, 20 years of it, until there was nothing left of him but the hatred, and when I got free of my ghosts and he could not get free of his, he could not bear it. I do not forgive him. He came to kill me, and would have made you a widow inside a year and blackened my name over my drowned body. But I understand him, God help me, better than I would like. He is what I might have become, Rowena, if I had gone on another 8 years alone in that locked room feeding my grief. He is the road I did not take, and the only reason I did not take it, the whole and entire reason, is you. She slipped her arm through his and leaned her head against his shoulder, and they stood a while in the low autumn sun among the roses, the mad Duke of Denmark and his rescuing bride, and neither of them said anything for a long time, because some things are past the reach of saying and are better simply stood together in the quiet. It was Lady Bramwell who insisted on the second ball. She came to Denmark in October in her carriage and her furs, and swept through the house, noting, with her sharp eyes, the open doors, the flowers, the warmth of it, the plain married ease between her nephew and his wife, and pronounced herself satisfied, which from Lady Bramwell was nearly a benediction. You will give a ball at Christmas, she informed them over dinner, and you will invite the whole county, and you will make it the finest Denmark has seen in 30 years, and you will stand up at the head of your own great room, the pair of you, and let every soul who ever whispered a word against either of you come and eat your beef and drink your wine and see with their own eyes what you have become. There is a right way to end a scandal, Adrian, and it is not to hide from it, and it is not to fight it. It is to outlive it in the open, so splendidly that no one can any longer remember why they ever believed the other thing. You will give a ball, and I will come, and I will wear the emeralds, and I will dance with the vicar, and it will be perfect. She fixed Rowena with her gimlet gaze. You will wear something magnificent, child, and you will stand beside your husband and be a duchess to the marrow, and you will let them all see that the girl they gossiped about as a schemer and a captive is the mistress of the greatest house in 3 counties and glad of it. Will you do it? Rowena, who had grown quite unafraid of Lady Bramwell over the months, and rather fond of her, laughed. I will do it, she said, on one condition, aunt, that you teach me which of the county I ought most to be gracious to and which I may safely snub, for I confess after this summer there are 1 or 2 I should dearly love to snub, and I do not trust myself to choose wisely. Lady Bramwell looked at her for a moment, And then she did a thing Adrian had seen her do perhaps 3 times in his life. She smiled fully with real warmth, the sharpness all gone out of her. "Oh," she said, "you will do. You will do very well indeed. I begin to see, nephew, why you married her. She has a proper sense of vengeance under all that gentleness. I approve of her entirely." And so the great doors of Denmore were flung open a second time at Christmas, and this time there was no dread in it and no Julian Crail to sour it, only light and warmth and music, and the whole county come to see the transformation for themselves. They came half out of curiosity and stayed all out of pleasure, for Rowena had a gift, it turned out, for making a great house welcoming, and the beef was good and the wine was better, and the musicians Lady Brumwell had commanded from York were the finest anyone had heard. And by midnight there was not a soul in the ballroom who could have told you with a straight face that they had ever thought the Duke of Denmore a monster. Adrian stood ahead of his own bright room, late in that evening, with a glass of wine he was not drinking, and watched his wife move through the crowd, magnificent, exactly as his aunt had commanded, in deep green silk with the Denmore pearls at her throat, laughing with the vicar's wife, drawing out a shy young girl who had been standing alone by the wall. Queen of the room and easy in it as though she had been born to it, which in every way that mattered she had, and he thought that he was, Paul, his old careful distrust of his own happiness, a fortunate man. He had been given a second life, not a continuation of the first mended, a genuinely second one, on the far side of a locked door and a black river, and he had done nothing to deserve it but to keep for 8 bleak years the one small stubborn habit of trying to be honest, until honesty had led him at last to a ruined library and a woman arguing over a Virgil. Rowena caught his eye across the room and read his face, as she always could now, and left the vicar's wife with a word and crossed to him through the crowd, she, to him as she had first come to him across the library that spring day, and slipped her hand through his arm. "You are brooding, your grace," she said, "at your own ball. It will start the tales up again if you are not careful. The county will say the mad duke has grown melancholy, and I shall have to go about all winter telling everyone you were only tired." "I was brooding," Adrian said. "I was counting my fortune, which is a different thing, though I grant they wear a similar face on me. I have got out of the habit of joy, Rowena. I am having to learn it again from the beginning at 38, like a boy at his letters, and it is slow work, and I keep expecting to be told I have got it wrong." He looked down at her. "But I am learning. You are a patient teacher. You have had a great deal of practice, I think, at being patient with slow, frightened creatures who do not know how to be safe." She laughed softly, and something in her face changed, grew a little grave, a little luminous, and she drew him a step apart, into the quiet by the tall dark windows where the frost stood on the glass and the winter park lay silver under the moon beyond, and she said low, so that only he could hear it under the music, "Then I shall have a good deal of practice yet, husband, teaching 2 of you at once. For I have news which I have been keeping the whole evening for exactly this moment, and I will tell it to you now, quietly, before I tell it to anyone in the world." She lifted his hand and pressed it, very gently against her own waist, and looked up into his face with her grey eyes shining. "In the summer, Adrian, when the roses come again, you are to be a father in the summer, when the roses come." For a moment Adrian Vane, 9th Duke of Denmore, who had faced a murderer at the ford and a black river twice in his life without flinching, could not speak at all. The music went on. The candles blazed. His whole bright ballroom turned and glittered a few feet away, unknowing, and Adrian stood at the frosted window with his hand pressed to his wife's waist and the winter park lying silver beyond the glass, and felt something break open in his chest that he had thought sealed over forever. Not the old grief, but its exact opposite, a joy so large and so unlooked for that it frightened him. For he had never learned how to hold a thing so good, and had spent his whole adult life braced against the losing of everything. "Rowena," he said, and his voice was not steady, and he did not care. "Rowena." "You need not say anything wise," she told him softly, watching his face with her clever, tender eyes. "You need not say anything at all. I only wanted you to have it first, before the toasts, before your aunt, before the county. I wanted it to be ours for one quiet minute at the window before it belonged to anyone else." She hesitated, and for a moment the old wariness flickered under her joy, the last faint ghost of the frightened girl who had braced at the altar for the worst. "You are glad?" she asked, very low. "Tell me you are glad, Adrian. I have wanted it, and I did not know until I knew that I feared you might not, that you might think of the succession, and the estate, and all the cold reasons a duke marries, and I did not want it to be a cold thing. I want it to be glad," Adrian said. And the word came out of him cracked and whole and utterly true, and he drew her to him there in the shadow by the window, careless for once of the watching room, and held them, his wife and the child that was coming with the summer roses. And against her hair he said the thing he had been 8 years and a whole locked wing learning how to say. "Glad is too small a word, and I have not got the larger one. There is no cold reason in me tonight. There is no reason in me at all, only you, and this and a gladness I do not know how to survive. I thought, Rowena, I thought when Cecily died that I had used up whatever a man is given of joy, that I had spent it foolishly and young and would live out my days on the memory of it. And instead I am given this, at 38, in a house I had made a tomb, with a woman I was never meant to love. Glad. I have never in my life been so glad, and I have never in my life been so afraid, because now there is so very much more to lose." "Then we shall not lose it," Rowena said, with the plain fierce certainty that had carried her through everything, and she drew back to look up at him. "We shall guard it and grow it, and live in the open in the sun and be happy, and let no locked door or black river or bitter neighbor have the least part at ever again. You saved yourself out of that water this summer, Adrian, and out of a great deal more than water. You are not the man the county feared, and you are not the man who grieved in the dark. You are only my husband, who asks my leave in everything and never once presses me, and who went into a river to save the life of a man who came to take his. And I am going to spend the rest of my life making sure you never again for 1 hour forget that you are worth the loving." Now, she wiped her eyes and lifted her chin and became, before his eyes, the Duchess again, magnificent in green and pearls. "Dry your face, your grace, and give me your arm, and let us go and be glad in the open where it belongs. And if your aunt guesses before I have told her, I shall never hear the end of it." They went back into the light together. The child came in the summer, as promised, when the roses were at their fullest along the south wall, a daughter, small and fair and fierce, with her mother's grey eyes. It would prove in time, her mother's straight back and her father's grave slow smile. They named her Cecily. It was Rowena who wished it, and Adrian who wept quietly, when she proposed it, not the old broken weeping of the locked room, but something washed clean and whole. For there is no laying of a ghost so complete as to speak its name again in love, over a living, breathing joy, and give the name back its brightness. The pale blue rooms in the north wing were opened that summer and aired, and the shrouds taken off the furniture, and the faded silks stripped, and the walls hung fresh, and the laughing portrait taken down at last and given honourably to Cecily Marchmont's aged mother, who wept over it and blessed the Duke she had spent 8 years believing a monster, and the rooms that had been a monument to grief became, in time, a nursery, full of light and small noise and the particular chaos of a much-loved child, and Adrian could not, afterward, pass down that corridor without a great and grateful astonishment at what a life may become if only a man is given time enough, and one good soul to spend it on. The county, which had once whispered of the mad Duke and his captive bride, whispered now, for a county must always be whispering something of the great love match at Denmore, and told and retold the story of the harvest night at the ford, until it grew in the telling to twice its true size, which was already large enough. It became, in time, the tale the whole district was proudest of, the tale they told visitors, the tale the old women told the young ones by the fire, how the feared Duke of Denmore, wed against her will to a ruined gentleman's daughter, had been so scrupulously gentle with her, had asked her leave in all things and pressed her in none, that she had come to love him of her own free choosing, and how a wicked neighbour had lured him to a black river to drown him, and how the Duke had answered by going into the water to save his very murderer's life, and how a marriage made in debt and dread had become the truest and deepest in 3 counties. It was a better story than the old one, and it had the singular virtue of being true, and it outlived, exactly as Lady Bramwell had promised, every lie that had gone before it. Adrian grew old at Denmore, in the end, but not for a long time, and never alone again. There were more children after Cecily, a son at last, to please the lawyers and the succession and no one else, for by then no one at Denmore cared a straw for cold reasons, and another daughter after him, and the great house that had been a tomb rang year on year with the noise of a family, and the walled garden filled with roses, and the doors stood open, and the north wing held nothing worse than a nursery, and later the schoolroom, and the Black River ran on under Denmore Bridge as rivers do, carrying its old sorrow away downstream a little further with each passing year, until it was only water again. He never lost the habit of it. The thing Rowena had first mistaken for coldness and had come to understand was the deepest part of him, the asking of leave, the waiting, the refusal ever to take what was not freely given. It was the shape his love wore. The wound turned at last to grace, and she never grew tired of it. On the last good evening of his life, an old man in the walled garden among the roses of another late summer, with his grey-eyed wife's hand in his, and his grown children, and their children somewhere in the house behind them making the good chaos, he had learned to live inside of. Adrian Vane turned to Rowena and said, as he had said to her 50 years before across the width of a desk, "You need never ask my leave to bring a dead thing back to life." And she laughed, the easy laugh he had loved above every other sound in the world since a spring day in a library, and leaned her white head against his shoulder. And they sat together in the last of the light among the roses she had planted a lifetime ago on a wall he had cleared for her before he ever dared to hope she might one day love him. He had married her against her will, in dread, both of them braced for the worst. He had asked her leave in everything, and pressed her in nothing, and waited a rose at a time, until a forced marriage had become, past all the odds the world had set against it, a free and true and deep one. It was the only thing he had ever done, Adrian thought, that he was entirely certain had been right, and it had turned the whole of his broken life to gold. And if he had it all to live again, the dread and the debt and the locked door and the black water, and every long patient hour of the waiting, he would not have changed a single day of it. For it had led him here, to this bench, this garden, this hand in his, this good and grateful and unlooked-for close of a life he had once been so sure would end in the dark. The roses nodded on the warm wall. The light went gold and then rose and then softly grey. And the Duke of Denmore, who had once been the most feared man in 3 counties and had become in the end only the most beloved, sat with his wife's hand in his in the garden they had made together and was, entirely and simply and to the very last, content.